Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Bonus episode, An Epirote Bride. As we've reached our 50th episode, which feels like a bit of a milestone in itself, I figured we'd have time for a bonus episode. This is because I came across a factoid while scanning through my sources, which I failed to cover during its proper place in the narrative. We're going to have to go back all the way to the late 4th century BCE. Why? Well, there's a fun fact I didn't know about the boy king Alexander IV of Macedon. He was married. Or at least, kind of. A bit of a recap might be in order at this point. Who even was Alexander IV of Macedon? After all, we last dealt with him when he died around 310 to 309 BCE. He was murdered on the orders of Cassander along with his mother Roxana. All of this feels forever ago, and you'd be right. At the time we paused the narrative in episodes 49 and 50, we were in about 246 BCE. 309 BCE, and thus the latest date for the death of Alexander IV, was approximately 63 years ago. I've seen various figures for how long a generation is, using the definition of a stereotypical generation in our modern day, or else how long it takes on average for a father to have a son or a mother to have a daughter. These figures all stay around 30 years per generation as a rough average. What this means is that the death of Alexander IV is already more than 2 full generations in the rearview mirror from our perspective. Alexander III's death is more than 3 generations ago. So, who was Alexander IV? He was the son of Alexander III, also called Alexander the Great, and Roxana. He was the grandson of Queen Olympias, who was still alive at that point. By contrast, his grandfather, Philip II of Macedon, had died in 336 BCE, over 10 years before little Alex Jr. himself was born. Alexander IV was born in about 323 or 322 BCE. His father was already dead, having died in June of 323 BCE. Diodorus Siculus writes that Alexander the Great handed his signet ring over to Perdiccas, but, when he was questioned as to the identity of the one who would govern after him, he replied that it should be the most powerful one who ruled after him. Not perhaps the most stable succession plan, as we saw during the wars of the Diadochoi, but there we go. The kingship was uncertain at this point. The infantry favoured Alexander's brother Arrhidaeus, although he was noted to have some sort of mental disability. Meleager was sent to deal with the situation, but instead joined the infantry, and Arrhidaeus was acclaimed as king. The army declared Arrhidaeus king as Philip, and Perdiccas to be his regent. Justinus says that a section of Alexander's empire was set aside for his unborn child in case it turned out to be male. Perdiccas had previously argued that everyone should wait for Alexander III's child to be born, and give it the kingship if male, while Meleager had voted for either crowning Arrhidaeus or Alexander's illegitimate son Heracles, both notably having the advantage of already being alive at the time. Perdiccas eventually squashed this uprising. An agreement was reached between the different interests among the Macedonians. Perdiccas would be regent for the nominal king Philip III, and Alexander's unborn baby would be monarch if a son. Alexander IV would go on to be sole king from his uncle's assassination in 317 BCE until his own death about 8 years down the line. With that recap of his life out of the way, let's turn now to the identity of this mystery betrothed. Alexander IV was betrothed to Didamia I of Epirus, who was still a child at the time. In 316 BCE, the child would suffer a siege alongside Alexander and Olympias, after having journeyed to be with them. The wording here is a little ambiguous, and we will dive into primary source material to try and clear it up, but I think this means they were betrothed by at least 316 BCE. This would make young Alexander IV about 6 years old. Let's go on a bit of a journey at this point to explore what exactly the relationship between these two was. Alexander IV was, through his father, the grandson of Olympias of Epirus. Olympias was the daughter of Neoptolemus I and the sister of Alexander I of Epirus. Alexander's son was Neoptolemus II, who would be overthrown by Pyrrhus I in 297 BCE. By contrast, Diodamia was the sister of Pyrrhus I, who will show up a lot more prominently in the story of the Roman Republic. Their father was Aeacides, who was himself the son of Aribas of Epirus and Troas, a daughter of Neoptolemus I. Aribas' father was Alcitas I, who was also the father of Neoptolemus I. And yes, for clarity in case you're lost among all these names, this means that Aribas married his own niece. I would say let that sink in for a moment, but at this point I don't think it's surprising anyone anymore, and it definitely won't do in the future. What does all of this mean? Well, the two share a joint ancestry via Neoptolemus I. Alexander IV of Macedon is the great-grandson of the old king, while Diodamia is simultaneously his great-granddaughter and his great-grandniece. If we take the simplest version of things, this means that Alexander IV and Diodamia were second cousins. This means they would have shared between 2% and 6% of their DNA, with an average of 3.13% for this relationship. As an interesting aside, we see here again a union between the families claiming descent from Achilles and from Heracles. As Plutarch points out, the son of Achilles by the name of Neoptolemus, also called Pyrrhus as a boy, was the ancestor of the family called the Pyrrhidae. This line included the eventual King Pyrrhus, who as we've seen above was a cousin of the King Neoptolemus II we touched on many episodes ago. In a similar vein, the Macedonians claim to be the descendants of a man called Temenus. The great-great-grandfather of Temenus was Heracles. So, we see the two royal lines joining again, as would have happened when Olympias of Epirus married Philip II of Macedon. As a final thought for today, what do our sources say? Plutarch points out that Diodamia later became the wife of Demetrius I, and had children including a son called Alexander. In his Life of Pyrrhus, he fleshes out Diodamia's family a little bit. Her mother was called Fiftieth, and she had a sister called Troas as well as her brother Pyrrhus. The marriage to Alexander IV was supposedly in name only. When things went south, with Plutarch euphemistically saying things went wrong rather than Alexander's murder being mentioned, Diodamia married Demetrius I when she was an adult. As we mentioned, she gave Demetrius I a son called Alexander. Supposedly, he lived out his days as a captive in Egypt. Even if it's not much of a link, I suppose we could have an echo of Alexander IV right here in a member of the Antigonid dynasty, a man who would also have been Alexander IV's stepson. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for what we could discuss in tangent episodes in future, feel free to reach out to me at the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.